You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 422, recorded on Sunday, April 17th, 2022. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This is our third episode in a row on electrification in the United States. First, we looked at the transition from electrochemical battery technology to electromagnetic power generators. Then we looked at urban electrification in the 1890s, tied in closely with streetcar electrification. The urban process happened almost overnight, and then it spread to towns, but electrification kind of stalled in the most rural parts of the country for a few more decades. This was partly economics and partly technological. In the most rural areas, there was a low customer density, which posed financial hurdles, but also there were huge losses of power along transmission lines over long distances to serve those relatively few and far between potential customers. So this week we'll look at how the United States overcame that, and then we'll compare that to the experience in a similar country in the same period. So let's start first by talking about the pre-New Deal era. So between that electrification of the cities in the 1890s and the New Deal electrification of the most rural areas in the 1930s, just so we can kind of get caught up to where we are contextually. So obviously, as we mentioned last week and talked about on its own dedicated episode, number 347 from February 2021, sort of the big push in this period, other than electrifying towns, was long-distance rail electrification. This was being undertaken privately by the railroad companies, and our episode on that, which I did with Justin Rosniak from Well, There's Your Problem, that leaned heavily on the book When the Steam Railroads Electrified, 1974 or 2002 updated edition by William D. Middleton, who also wrote the book that we talked about with regard to streetcars last week. So this era of long-distance rail electrification in the United States spanned the first decade of the 1900s through the 1930s. Now, as we talked about on that episode last year, a 1936 Federal Power Commission report identified 20 railroads with some 12,000 miles of track that could be cost-effectively electrified, but U.S. rail electrification actually peaked in 1938 at just 6,300 miles total. Although the cost savings for operations were huge after electrification, the upfront capital investments required to install electrification and buy new equipment was another huge hurdle. And that's something that we're going to see as a repeated theme when we talk about the New Deal and the process for rural consumer electrification. And similarly, the Great Depression hit revenues of these companies hard enough that further electrification was dependent on federal government loans. And we're going to get to that in a few minutes, but that is sort of the big theme today, obviously, is that it required central planning and central government financing or financial assistance and guarantees in order to pull it off. Now, rural towns, actually, by the end of the 1920s, had started to reach similar levels of proportional electrification as cities, i.e. around 90% of homes, because a modest local power plant could serve all the customers there in a compact area. So the problem by the end of the 1920s, which is going to set up our main focus today on the 1930s, the problem at this point was that the extremely rural and spread out smallholder farms, as opposed to, agribusiness farms that we definitely see later. And remember, we're about to enter the period of, the Dust Bowl and so forth. So that's the kind of farms that we're generally talking about here. They didn't have any electricity. They needed electricity, but they were very spread out. And it was just going to be, it was seen as this insurmountable challenge. So high estimates put the rate of electrification by this time period at 10%. For these sort of rural farmsteads, but other estimates, as we'll talk about, put it far lower. By 1923, several years earlier, it was already clear to industry leaders and political leaders that American farms and their families would be measurably, significantly more productive and happier if they had electricity access. But the private utilities estimated that the cost per mile might be as high as $2,000 in contemporary money, which would be tens of thousands per mile adjusted to 2020 inflation. There were simply no economies of scale, and the retail electricity price to customers would be prohibitive as well. Now, Rachel, one thing that I had been wondering as we were going into this episode was whether or not there was on-site power, even on a small scale, being generated on some of these farms, as opposed to grid electrification. That's one of the themes that we talked about with regard to the early electrification of cities and factories in the United States, is on-site power generation versus grid power. Could you talk a little bit about that distinction, and what the sort of alternative was if you wanted to electrify a farm before there was grid access?
Yeah, so I found a very informative article from Rural Electric Magazine that really fit into the scope of this episode very well. And it was called The First Wind Power Boom, which gives you a hint as to what I'm about to talk about. So between 1920 and 1935, farmers and ranchers purchased 1 million wind chargers, which are not the iconic windmills used since the 1850s to pump water for crops and livestock and are still seen along rural back roads. But these were small propeller-driven electricity generators. So the essential components were the propeller and tail, and an attached generator and wires leading indoors to a control panel and a battery. So that tail was it was very clever. It was to point the wind propellers at the wind to turn at the slightest wind. So it was really efficient at capturing whatever wind was available. And the smallest wind chargers were really for charging radio batteries. So at its peak, the Wind Charger Corporation, which was the leading manufacturer, produced 2,000 of its 6-volt deluxe models each day at its factory in Sioux City, Iowa. So 6 volts, pretty small, small charge, not high capacity in the least, but it was enough for the needs of a small farmhouse or a barn. And these machines sold for $44, or better yet, $15 when purchased with a Zenith radio and a 6-volt battery. We've talked about radios in past episodes. So the bundle deal was probably very attractive for these farmhouses. You could power a light, you could power a radio, really kind of bringing the creature comforts to these extremely rural farmhouses. Another Iowa company, Paris Dunn Corporation, made wind chargers ranging in size from 135 watts to 3,000 watts. So generating a bit more power for your home, you're able to bring in more lights, more comforts into your home. And between 1934 and 1941, the company shipped 37,000 units to all 48 states and 93 foreign countries. So they were actually a pretty big enterprise, reaching not just domestic audiences, but foreign purchasers as well.
As you said, this seems like a really small amount of power generation, though. I would even push back. I don't know if it's really the creature comforts as the absolute, like, bare minimum in terms of power. Like you said, they now can run a radio, which means they're going to be getting those fireside chats and so forth, but not necessarily seeing the rest of the benefits. And they're going to be able to, maybe keep 1 or 2 light bulbs on. That's about it. Meanwhile, the rest of the country is starting to get refrigerators, artificial ice boxes, things like that. We're not quite into the dishwashers era of the post-war period, but we're starting to get a lot more kitchen appliances and things like that. And so these farmsteads are getting left further and further behind up until 1935 onward, when we get to the heart of what we're going to be talking about today. What is the thing that ends up supplanting these very sort of paltry and rudimentary farmstead electrifications?
Yeah, so quoting from the article, but none of this mechanical genius could stand up to the convenience and affordability of central station power and the success that the Federal Rural Electrification Administration had in making it available to farms, ranches, and small towns. Starting in the late 1930s, electric co-ops regularly lopped off county-sized chunks of the wind charger market, and this didn't let up until the early 1950s. So this ties in really nicely to the next phase of rural electrification and the meat of the episode, which is the New Deal era. FDR's making great strides in rural electrification. It's one of his big talking points on his campaign, really, is bringing electricity to rural America and bringing these parts of the country into the modern era, enjoying the same benefits that the city dwellers and even the small towns were enjoying at this time. So First, I wanted to call back to a prior episode we did, episode 190, that was recorded in August of 2017. And that dealt with FDR's 1932 campaign speeches against private power utilities. And we touched on a September 21, 1932 Portland, Oregon speech, where he particularly really hammered home his point that power utilities, private power utilities, needed to be regulated by the federal government. I wanted to take a few sound bites, a few meaty quotes from that speech. I have spoken on several occasions of a quote unquote New Deal for the American people. I believe that the New Deal, as you and I know it, can be applied to a whole lot of things. It can be applied very definitely to the relationship between the electric utilities on the one side and the consumer and the investor on the other. True regulation is for the equal benefit of the consumer and the investor. The only man who will suffer from true regulation is the speculator or the unscrupulous promoter who levies tribute equally from the man who buys the service and from the man who invests his savings in this great industry. And the final line from his speech, never shall the federal government part with its sovereignty or with its control of its power resources while I'm President of the United States. So those are very strong words. And he did back those up during his administrations as President of the United States. Another big, powerful section in his speech. But these cold figures do not measure the human importance of the electric power in our present social order. Electricity is no longer a luxury. It is a definite necessity. It lights our homes, our places of work, and our streets. It turns the wheels of most of our transportation and our factories. In our homes, it serves not only for light, but it can become the willing servant of the family in countless ways. It can relieve the drudgery of the housewife and lift the great burden off the shoulders of the hard-working farmer. I say can become because we are most certainly backward in the use of electricity in our American homes and on our farms. In Canada, the average home uses twice as much electric power per family as we do in the United States. What prevents our American people from taking full advantage of this great economic and human agency? The answer is simple. It is not because we lack undeveloped water power or unclaimed supplies of coal and oil. The reason is that we cannot take advantage of our own possibilities. The reason is frankly and definitely that many selfish interests in control of light and power industries have not been sufficiently far-sighted to establish rates low enough to encourage widespread public use. So that really underlines the scope of this episode. The power industries, the light and power industries at this time, did not want to make investments that would reap benefits in the future, but at a short-term great cost. And so FDR really felt that he had to step in and kind of force the hand of these industries and force them to bring power to these rural homesteads, really. And that started in May of 1935 when he released Executive Order 7037, the Rural Electrification Administration. So the full text is available. We link to it in our show notes. But the big thrust of it is to initiate, formulate, administer, and supervise a program of approved projects with respect to the generation, transmission, and distribution of electric energy in rural areas. And he backed that up with the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. So this was really pushed through Congress by Texas Congressman and eventual U.S. House Speaker Sam Rayburn. He was a New Dealer. He was fully invested in the New Deal, and he was a champion of FDR's rural electrification initiatives. And he stated that the share of electrified farm homes in the U.S. climbed from just 3%, so again, those low estimates of how many farms were electrified at that time, to over 90% over the course of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So originally, Congress set aside $100 million, which is equivalent to $1.88 billion in 2020 dollars, for this new agency, and it enabled it to make loans to finance the construction of electricity generation and transmission to rural areas. So we're drawing our facts and figures for the Rural Electrification Act from an article linked in the show notes from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, which published an economic history article on the Rural Electrification Act. And again, this is linked in the show notes. So the plan as first envisioned by Congress, not necessarily the FDR administration with its natural skepticism verging on hostility to private utilities, was that the government would simply help private utilities with the funding and financing, but it would still be a private endeavor. The administration then imposed enough conditions on the proposed terms that most private utilities walked away from the table, which cleared a path to do what FDR's people probably actually wanted to do all along, which was to structure the program like many other traditional agricultural region programs in the form of customer-owned and governed local and regional co-ops to purchase power on the market and sell it to customers at prices as close to wholesale as possible, and also without deriving a profit margin. In 1930, as a benchmark comparison before the REA, there were only 33 power co-ops in the entire United States. The REA even distributed model legislation across the 48 states for legislatures to adopt, authorizing and regulating such co-ops if they did not already have such a law on the books. Customers would pay a $5 fee to join the co-op. The REA also carefully structured the co-op arrangements so that any default on a federal loan, including to farm customers, would simply result in repossession of the electrical equipment and appliances with zero risk of the farm itself being seized. The co-ops themselves received very low-interest loans from the federal government to build their infrastructure out, and the REA built a team of in-house engineering consultants to offer optimizations of grid design and implementation for specifically rural environments to get the most cost efficiencies possible. Generally, the power that co-ops were buying actually came from existing private utility companies who simply did not want to expand their distribution infrastructure, but the REA would finance brand new co-op power generation if the private utilities refused to negotiate a fair contract with the co-ops. And as an aside, beginning in 1935, private power utilities had theoretically come under much more government regulation and mandatory reorganization via the Wheeler-Rayburn Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, which broke up the power conglomerate holding companies into government-approved geographic monopolies, where companies no longer competed for territory, but also no longer operated everywhere as giant sprawling firms. That being said, these power conglomerates were still fighting this breakup policy tooth and nail in the courts at the time. The REA didn't just build new power plants and put up transmission lines and grid connections, but actually came to people's homes and installed basic wiring and light fixtures throughout houses and barns. This was partly a practical service, but also was meant to boost the demand per farm to try to get a bit more economy of scale benefit to hooking up each individual small farm. The REA also offered low-interest financing for electrical appliances in farm homes, which few other countries in the world did as part of their rural electrification programs. This had the double effect of instantly boosting rural standards of living, and again simply boosting the power demand per household to create more economies of scale. Small farmers were apparently willing to devote nearly a quarter of their annual incomes to electricity bills because of the benefits to their households and the productivity gains to the farm itself. By the end of World War II, less than a decade after the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, half of American farms were electrified, and the process of finishing electrifying the country took only about a quarter century in all from the mid-1930s. Less than 1% of all REA loans ended up in default, which is a pretty impressive rate. Another big effort from the New Deal era was the administration of the Tennessee Valley Authority. So even before the Rural Electrification Administration and the comprehensive federal studies of the problem of rural electrification, FDR had come into office in the spring of 1933 with a ready-to-roll proposal for a government electrification and power production agency in the Tennessee River Valley that President Hoover had been blocking for years on ideological grounds. This was one of the poorest and most underinvested regions of the United States. While the TVA had many mandates on a range of rural matters, for this episode we will simply focus on the power projects, such as the hydroelectric dam construction that broke ground before 1933 had even come to a close. Between 1933 and 1942, 11 hydropower dams were built, and enormous coal-fired steam turbine plants were also constructed, all of which proved critical for the war effort, both for materiel production and uranium enrichment. By the end of the war, the TVA was the largest electricity-producing entity in the United States, and hydro remained its primary power source until 1955, when coal overtook it. And the TVA eventually also got into nuclear power a decade after that. In 1966, the TVA began construction on its first nuclear power plant, Browns Ferry, in North Alabama. So the TVA Act gave the TVA the, quote, power to acquire real estate for the construction of dams, reservoirs, transmission lines, powerhouses, and other structures, and navigation projects at any point along the Tennessee River or any of its tributaries, unquote. And I found a great resource on TVA.com's website. They have a really extensive history section that kind of goes through the decades since the introduction of the TVA. And there's lots of great pictures, just a really good piece of historical archives that are available on their website. There are a couple caveats involved. It wasn't all great. The TVA's employment practices were quite racially exclusionary or hierarchical, and women tended to be excluded as well. And one of the dams that got built, Norris Dam, required the displacement of more than 125,000 valley residents, or roughly 15,000 families, as well as some cemeteries and small towns, which caused some to oppose the projects, especially in rural areas. The projects also inundated several Native American archaeological sites, and graves were reinterred at new locations along with new tombstones. Overall, it was a huge, huge endeavor. There were some bad things, but it also did really bring electricity to this poor region of the United States. So as always, there's good and bad parts in history. So post New Deal, the Rural Electrification Act has been amended some 15 times since 1936, beginning in the 1940s, and it did eventually encompass rural telephone, cable, and internet service, which we will have to defer to another episode. However, because there are still almost 900 rural electric co-ops operating across the U.S., it is a model often floated for finally completing the long-stalled work of rural internet service provision that the private providers have endlessly dragged their heels on, or produced the barest minimum levels of service, well behind not only the rest of the country, but much of the world. In 2018, during the Trump years, remarkably enough, the FCC actually began offering financing to rural electric co-ops to become internet providers. So it's kind of an interesting mirror of the past into the present. Rural internet is in the U.S. is pretty appalling, and just as with rural electrification, providers are really dragging their heels, really looking to short-term costs as a reason to put off these improvements, and kind of ignoring the long-term benefits that provisioning rural residents with internet would provide.
Well, at this point in the episode, we're going to do what we've done on some previous episodes, although I think it's been a while since we've done this, which is to make a comparison between what was going on in the United States in this period, especially the 1930s, and what was going on elsewhere in the world, and specifically the country that is probably the most comparable on this specific point. Now, you have to be careful when you say that, because the United States really didn't have a lot of good comparisons by a lot of metrics. And in particular, a lot of the other industrialized leading economies of the world at this time were geographically much smaller, which automatically creates some different situations with regard to the technological issues, especially around long-distance grid transmission and so forth. But a lot of these countries were also quite heavily urbanized, and the United States, we should emphasize, did have a very, very urban population by the 1920s and 1930s. However, because of its physical size, the rural and the overall population, while proportionally quite small, was still a significant pocket of people and was very, very, very spread out, right? If you were to compare to someplace like England, sure, you still have some rural areas, but they are much closer together and so forth. So that leaves us with only one comparison that's even really close, and that is, of course, the Soviet Union. So the United States of the early 20th century was not the only geographically massive agrarian economy with uneven population distribution trying to figure out how to electrify and modernize agriculture. Again, we have to be careful with the limitations of this comparison because the Soviet Union at the time of the Communist Revolution, Russia specifically, was very, very far behind all these other countries in its development. And so in many ways, it's definitely still playing catch up in this period. But generally, as I like to say, the history of the Soviet Union, or Russia, however you want to put it, in terms of its industrial, economic, human development, all that kind of progress, was trying to condense down everything that the United States did from 1870 to 1970 into half the time, right? So starting 50 years into that process, around 1920, trying to play catch up. And they managed to pull it off, right? By most metrics, the United States and the Soviet Union were pretty similar by about 1970. In terms of their sort of technology and their industrialization levels and so forth, but also things like various human factors. Even if you look at, for example, height, which often is a proxy for how good your country's agricultural supply is and how much nutrition is available to people. The average height of men and women in the United States and the Soviet Union, or Russia before the Soviet Union, is, it's going up, but it starts going up quite fast in the United States with the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, say the 1870s and so forth, and then that continues until, around 1970 or so. And in Russia and then subsequently the Soviet Union, you also see this, but on a much more constricted time scale, again, beginning around the same time as the Soviet Union starts. So we're talking about 1920s and 1930s. And so again, the way that I shorthand it is usually that most of these things, it takes Russians about half the time to achieve what the United States was doing, starting from a pretty bad base and playing catch up quite quickly, starting after the 1920s. So with that in mind, let's get into this comparison in terms of electrification, and by necessity in Russia, we mean rural electrification in no small part. The Communist Party in Soviet Russia and the USSR made countrywide electrification a major policy priority beginning in February 1920. This would have been just after the revolution and during the Civil War. The party leadership during the Civil War was already struggling immensely to bridge the cultural and economic divide between the Russian cities and the Russian countryside. Peasants who had supported the communist revolution for its promises of land reform didn't grasp why the central leadership wanted and indeed needed them to increase surplus grain production and yields rather than engaging in autonomous subsistence farming, even as urban residents were on the brink of starvation because surplus grain was not being produced and delivered to the cities. Lenin said that electrification was critical to solving the problem, not just for its technological importance, but also for its political and economic implications in unifying the country. Quote, "The organization of industry on the basis of modern advanced technology on electrification, which will provide a link between town and country, will put an end to the division between town and country, will make it possible to raise the level of culture in the countryside and to overcome, even in the most remote corners of the land, backwardness, ignorance, poverty, disease, and barbarism." In a December 1920 speech releasing the planning document, Lenin said, "What we must now try is to convert every electric power station we build into a stronghold of enlightenment to be used to make the masses electricity conscious, so to speak." And that would be in comparison to politically conscious. Russia's steam railroads were also a disaster after World War I and the Russian Civil War, and in the cases where grain surplus was being produced, it often wasn't being moved to where it needed to go, and it would just rot in the stations, which didn't go over very well. Lenin again saw electrification as the solution here by converting the entire Russian rail system to electric motive power, which was a transition, as we said, underway in much of the United States by this point in the early 1920s. Lenin did not live to see Soviet rail electrification begin, but it did actually start in 1926, albeit fairly slowly, and notably with significant assistance from General Electric in the U.S. Still, Lenin's dream of communist electrification was ambitious and got the ball rolling. Even the British science fiction author H.G. Wells, who obviously had, all kinds of fantastical, wonderful technological visions of the future, he came away from a meeting with Lenin in 1920 feeling that his nationwide electrification vision was easily the least realistic and most utopian dream of the entire communist project in Russia, in no small part due to the massive geography and sparse population distributions. By 1934, Wells returned to the Soviet Union and admitted that he was stunned by the progress being made on electrification. In 1913, the final year before World War I under Imperial Russia, the entire country had only created the capacity for 1.9 billion kilowatt hours of power generation as part of its ongoing state efforts to develop an urban industrial base, and probably quite a bit of this was located in industrial zones that ended up outside of the Soviet Union after the war and the borders were redrawn. One of the many wartime negligences of the imperial government was a merely vague understanding of the state of crisis in the fledgling power sector and its negative effects in the war effort. And, as with every other logistical crisis, they did even less to fix it than they were aware of it. In 1920, when the communist plan was launched, they could barely keep the lights on in Russian cities at all. Although, again, I want to emphasize that is not their fault. That was the existing conditions that they inherited and the conditions of the Civil War and so forth. By 1931, however, this is just over 10 years later, the USSR had developed 8.8 billion kilowatt hours of power capacity, and by the following year had grown that again by another 50% to 13.5 billion kilowatt hours. Again, to compare to 1913, which had been 1.9 billion kilowatt hours. In 1937, which again, just to keep the context in mind, was a year after the U.S. Congress had passed the Rural Electrification Act in the United States, the Soviet Union was now generating 36 billion kilowatt hours and added 12 billion more by 1940. All this power was developed out of the 1920 Central Planning under the slogan, "Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country." And this slogan and plan envisioned 10 signature hydroelectric turbine power plants, various other types of regional power plants, and many other on-site power plants dedicated to major state enterprise factories. However, after Lenin's death, in many cases the results diverged from the vision by making electrification more of a supporting player to the overall push for industrial development rather than a general goal with ordinary consumer benefits as a focus in its own right. This meant much of the power was quite consolidated and narrow in the pre-World War II period, largely focused on the biggest cities and biggest factories. Notably, this was similar to the approach favored under the Tsarist regime, which saw electrification as an industrial tool, not a social and political transformation. The main difference was that the Communist Party continued to keep the social and political goals in mind as something to get around to, which they eventually did. Some of that is my notes from the Wikipedia page on GOELRO, which was the acronym for the Soviet Electrification Program and Agency. But a lot of that is actually also drawn from the book The Electrification of Russia, 1880 to 1926, by Jonathan Coopersmith from 1992, Cornell University Press. Chapters 6 through 8 focus on the Soviet period, and especially Chapter 8 is basically a sort of conclusion wrap-up and has various statistics on power generation capacity. Now, as a bit of a coda here, in the aftermath of World War II, the Soviets eventually got back to work with electrification, later including nuclear power, and in the US it was also assumed that things like widespread railroad electrification would as well resume almost immediately. And many projects were identified as possibilities, but none of them ever got built. And the US was in the 17th place in rail electrification by the early 1970s. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had almost 20 times more electrified rail mileage by then, which again speaks to this point that the U.S. had its sort of big industrial wave, or at least second industrial wave, from 1870 to 1970, depending on how you want to count it, and the Soviet Union was trying to catch up on all those metrics and often did catch up or even surpass the United States in half the time from 1920 to 1970. After the war, there were not enough private capital flowing to the American projects, and the newly proven diesel-electric technology seemed like a cheaper stepping stone to electrification at some future date. This never happened. The 1970s saw renewed interest in U.S. rail electrification between the rising traffic and the oil shock, but by the time the studies were done at the start of the 1980s, the price pressures against diesel had subsided again, and nothing came of any of this. But today, Russia still has a pretty significant rail electrification network, whereas the United States very much does not. So sort of two paths diverge there, and despite all the troubles that Russia has had and being exploited and pillaged by the United States after the Cold War, they still managed to hang on to their very impressive electric rail network, which has provided them a lot of advantages. I think that what we sort of see with the United States is that once we got everyone to have enough electricity at their farms for dishwashers and air conditioners and so forth in the 1950s and so forth, in the 1950s and beyond, the interest sort of wanes, and they just say, okay, the United States is fully electrified, we don't need to worry about anything more, and kind of stall, whereas the Soviet Union sort of kept going because they were still trying to catch up, so they had some different incentives in the immediate post-war period. So, Rachel, I will turn to you now to talk a little bit more about any of your thoughts on this as we sort of wind down our electrification arc in the United States. I think, as you said, we will circle back at some point to talk about sort of the postscript on this, which is around things like rural telephone, rural internet, rural cable TV, things like that. But we've at least covered the bulk of the story of U.S. electrification over the course of the 19th and first half of the 20th century.
Well, I think it really boils down to what FDR said in his campaign speech. The selfish interests have not been sufficiently far-sighted to establish rates low enough to encourage widespread public use, and that applies to all of the utilities that you just mentioned. So it's really it really shows just the weaknesses of having private industry providing these utilities.
Especially natural monopolies like this. I mean,
exactly.
That's why both these huge, geographically huge countries with significant rural and farm sectors pursue central planning in both cases.
Right. And he compared the U.S. to Canada as well. And Canada is also a very large, spread out population. So they, by the 1930s, they were using twice as much electric power per family as the United States. So I think, yeah, he just really pointed out these public utilities just really lacked the will to bring everybody up to a higher standard of living just because it was inconvenient to do so.
Well, it's also misleading to call them public utilities, right? I mean, I was thinking about that when we were discussing the public utilities holding company reforms of the 1930s as well. Wheeler Rayburn is these aren't public, right? And that's the problem. They're for the benefit of the public, so they're referred to as public utilities. But in fact, up until the 1930s, these were privately owned, managed, for-profit, private decision-making, et cetera. And that was a huge problem because this is a natural monopoly that should be publicly owned and for the public benefit, or at least cooperatively owned.
Mm-hmm. And we still see those weaknesses today. Like PG&E frequently gets money to upgrade their services, upgrade their infrastructure, and they just don't use the money that way. And then we get giant wildfires in California. So it's still a problem. These companies providing these public utilities just sucking up public money for their own private benefit.
Well, Rachel, I think that about covers the story of electrification in the United States. And for good measure, as I said, we threw in a comparison to the Soviet Union so people could kind of see what was happening at the same time, and that it was relatively similar what was happening at the same time. You're going to be going on a well-deserved vacation shortly, so we'll be having some other episodes that do not feature you coming up. But thanks so much for coming on this week.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting topic, for sure.